Yes, Your Honor.
Yes, Your Honor.
All right, we just received a message that we can get started. Let's call the case of the estate of Genesis Petrillo versus Harper Martini and Peony Estates. My name is Judge Graciela Freixas. I'm a judge with the Los Angeles Superior Court. Scoring judges, please look to the two buttons on the the lower left of your screen, and remember to keep your audio and video off unless a tournament coordinator tells you otherwise. You should also have your video set to hide all non-video participants so that only people on the screen should be the advocates and myself. Can the attorneys please make appearances, beginning with the prosecution, the plaintiff?
Hello, Your Honor. My name is Emma Klinkhammer, and today I'll be joined by my co-counsel, Miss Maddie Hunsinger.
Hello, Your Honor.
Good morning.
And Miss Ruthie Hale.
Hello, Your Honor.
Good morning.
Collectively, we represent the plaintiff in today's case, the estate of Genesis Petrillo, and we will be pursuing a claim of negligence per se today.
Thank you. Defense.
Good morning, Your Honor. My name is Tess Paxson, and I use she, her pronouns, along with my co-counsel, Miss Hannah Johnson, who uses she, her pronouns, and Mr. Thomas Finn, who uses he, him. We will be representing the defense, Peony Estates Winery.
Good morning to the defense team. Did you wish to introduce your witnesses?
Your Honor, I believe we'll do so at the beginning of each direct, if that's okay.
Very well. Any pretrial matters that we need to attend to?
Yes, Your Honor. The plaintiff would have a few if I could proceed with those.
Very well.
We'd just like to invoke Rules 603 and 615, which is the constructive swearing in and sequestration of all witnesses.
That'll be noted.
Also, Your Honor, we'd like to just point your attention to Stipulation 3, which states that Exhibits 1 through 10 are pre-admitted today and can be referenced throughout trial.
So noted.
Finally, we'd just like to ask for your preferences for screen sharing exhibits and demonstratives. Would you like us to narrate before we do so or ask permission?
Narrate would be fine, just to identify what you're about to display.
Yes, Your Honor. And with that, the plaintiff is ready to proceed.
Any pretrial matters for the defense?
Yes, Your Honor. First, the defense would like to draw your attention to our answers to the plaintiff's negligence per se claim, specifically claim numbers 17, 18, and 21. Today, the defense denies that Peony Estates violated the Midlands Building Code, and we also deny that the acts or omissions of the defendant caused harm to Genesis Petrillo. Next, we would like to highlight stipulations regarding Exhibits 2A and 2B, which are pre-entered in today's case under Stipulation 3, as counsel just mentioned. Stipulation 11 provides that these exhibits are pictures of the Carl wine bottle that was given to Genesis Petrillo, and that this bottle was later recovered from the police. And after being recovered, this bottle tested positive for the presence of pesticides. Stipulation 17 provides, however, that a canister of pesticide was found within the same dumpster where the police recovered these exhibits. Finally, we just ask for your Honor's preferences regarding publishing exhibits over Zoom. Given the constraints of this format, we will need to display exhibits on the screen in order to lay the proper foundation for admittance. May we constructively do so before publishing to the jury for viewing?
Yes.
And with that, the defense is ready to proceed.
Perfect. All right, we will now hear opening statements from each party. Everyone should make sure they are in speaker view. The button is in the upper right of your screen. Attorneys, please remember to mute your audio when the other attorney is speaking. And if we could start with plaintiff's opening, please.
Yes, Your Honor. May I proceed when ready?
Yes.
Ms. Johnson, members of the jury, may it please the court. Peony Estates was careless, and carelessness has consequences. You see, the defendant, Peony Estates, is a winery located right here in Midlands. They grow grapes, produce wine, bottle and sell that wine all off one property. But this property has a pest problem, and in order to control this pest problem, Peony Estates uses chemical pesticides. While these pesticides are legal in the state of Midlands, they are dangerous and can be deadly. And so Midlands has written laws about how they can be used and stored. When businesses are careless and break these laws, there are consequences. And that's exactly what happened in 2019 at Peony Estates. You see, in the year leading up to June 7th of 2019, Peony Estates produced a bottle of wine that they called Cara 2019. During the year it took to produce this wine, Peony Estates was careless in how they stored their pesticide. Because they were careless with how they stored their pesticide, that bottle of Cara wine became contaminated with deadly levels of pesticide. Peony Estates was careless again when they gave that bottle of wine to Genesis Petrillo. Genesis Petrillo was a young woman who was supposed to get married on June 8th. She drank that bottle of Cara wine the night before her wedding, and by the morning, she was dead. And that's why we as the plaintiff have brought forth the claim of negligence per se. Now, in order to prove negligence per se to you, we have to prove to you 4 elements by a preponderance of the evidence, which just means more likely than not. We have to prove that first, Peony Estates violated a law. Second, that law was a safety law. Third, that Peony Estates' violation of that law caused harm to Genesis Petrillo. And lastly, that Genesis Petrillo was a member of that law's protected class. Now, Peony Estates agrees with elements 2 and 4. So all that's in contention today are these first and third elements. And we will prove these to you by showing you the careless actions of Peony Estates and the consequences that those actions had. We'll show you that Peony Estates was careless in how they stored their pesticide and broke Midland's building code in doing so. We're going to call Riley Adkins O'Keefe to the stand. Mr. O'Keefe is a health inspector with the Midlands Food and Drug Administration, who visited Peony Estates during that time that Cara was produced. He's going to tell you that he saw Peony Estates improperly store their pesticide and that these actions can lead to contamination. Next, we're going to show you that Peony Estates was careless and served that wine to Genesis Petrillo. We're going to call Casey Soto to the stand. Mick Soto was Genesis Petrillo's fiance, the person that Genesis was going to marry on June 8th, the same day that she died. Mick Soto is going to tell you about their fiance and tell you about what they saw at Peony Estates. Last, we're going to show you the consequences of Peony Estates' actions. We're going to call Dr. Jimin Quan to the stand. Dr. Quan is a toxicology expert and the physician who treated Genesis Petrillo on the night of her death. He's going to tell you that Genesis Petrillo's death was caused by pesticide that was in the wine she had drank the night before. After you've heard all the evidence today, my co-counsel, Maddie Hunsinger, is going to come before you. She's going to walk you through all the evidence that appeared at trial, and she's going to show you those careless actions of Peony Estates. She's going to ask you to hold Peony Estates accountable for their carelessness and find them liable. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Hale. Opening statement for the defense.
Yes, Your Honor. May it please the court? Counsel, members of the jury, I'm going to start by telling you something we've all known since we were just kids. You can't finish a puzzle if you don't have all the pieces. Now, Ms. Hale came before you just now and attempted to hand you a picture of what happened here. That picture will prove to be both incomplete and unrecognizable because their case is missing vital pieces. Because Genesis Petrillo's death was so tragic and unexpected, it's entirely natural to want to blame someone. Peony Estates is just not our answer today. So let's start where Ms. Hale did. Peony Estates' irresponsibility in handling these pesticide treatments. In order to properly define irresponsibility today, the plaintiff is going to need to reference Midlands Building Code section 12100, what you see before you now, and further how this law was violated. So you and I, let's take a moment to look a little deeper into this code we've got before us. On the first page, barely halfway down, we recognize the requirement effective measures shall be taken to exclude pests from the processing areas. A major purpose for the code in question today is dedicated to telling businesses of the dangers of pests. Peony Estates did suffer insect infestation on multiple accounts. However, the evidence brought before you today will show that they never once stepped outside of the bounds of this here code. Now, pesticides are an overtly dangerous chemical, that's clear. So the question in your head right now must be, how did Peony Estates maintain effective measures in combating insect infestation while simultaneously maintaining their responsibility with these chemicals? The defense is going to make sure that before you leave this courtroom today, you're aware of a plethora of precautionary measures utilized by Peony Estates. At no point will the plaintiff be able to prove through evidence that they ever once stepped outside of the bounds of this code, nor that their products were left to the risk of overt or negligent contamination. But even if there had been a violation, their puzzle is still missing a crucial piece. None of us get to pack up and go home once the plaintiff says, hey, Peony Estates broke a rule. No, their burden is met only if they can then link that violation directly to the harm that Genesis Petrillo suffered. A link that their evidence today simply won't be able to support. You're going to learn that no actual wine consumed by Ms. Petrillo was ever tested in their investigation. That the empty bottle of wine recovered by police was exposed to pesticides the day after Ms. Petrillo had consumed it. And most importantly, that nothing else Ms. Petrillo drank or ate that night was ever able to be safely eliminated as a source for these pesticides. At the end of trial today, members of the jury, you will not walk back into that deliberation room with all the pieces to their puzzle. The picture that they will have handed you will prove to be incomplete, because Peony Estates is just not our answer here. Do not fill in these missing pieces for the plaintiff. However, if you do find yourself doing so today, the law will require a verdict of not liable. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. All right, before the plaintiff calls its first witness, please switch to gallery view. That button is in the upper right of your screen. This will allow you to see the attorneys and the witnesses at the same time. And with that, plaintiff, if you would call your first witness.
Yes, Your Honor. Plaintiff calls Riley Adkins O'Keefe. May I proceed?
Yes.
Please state your name for the court.
Hi there, my name's Riley Adkins O'Keefe.
Mr. O'Keefe, what do you do for a living?
I'm a health inspector with the Midlands Food and Drug Administration.
And what are your responsibilities as a health inspector for the Midlands FDA?
Well, they're everything that's in my name. I'm a health inspector, so naturally I inspect. Specifically, I inspect businesses that make food and drinks right here in Midlands and make sure that they're following all of the relevant health codes, safety codes, and building codes.
When you're making sure that businesses are following the law, do you have any sort of process that you use?
Yes, I do. I use a 3-step process that all of my colleagues at the FDA use.
And what's the first step in your process?
That's a visual inspection, and it's exactly what it sounds like. Essentially, I walk around the premises and see if my eyes can detect any sort of code violations or things that need to be looked into.
What's the second step in that process?
Well, that's what I jokingly refer to as interrogation, but I promise it's not as sinister as it sounds. You can think of it like me asking my daughter, who ate all the Pop-Tarts? It's essentially me going around to the employees of whatever business I'm at and asking them about code violations that I've seen, how they occurred, and what we can do to correct them.
What's the final step in your process when investigating a business?
That would be follow-up. That's me doing whatever I have to do to ensure that consumers are safe. Sometimes this is testing product. Other times this is putting people or even a business on probation. Whatever it is, I make sure that I follow up on my previous 2 parts of my process.
Now, you mentioned that you investigate businesses to make sure that they're following all relevant laws. Are you familiar with Midland's Building Code, Section 12-100?
Yes, I am. It's one of the several codes I had to learn in order to become a health inspector.
Would you recognize that if I were to show it to you?
I would, yes.
I'm now sharing to the screen an excerpt from Midland's Building Code, Section 12-100. Mr. O'Keefe, can you tell us what this code says that businesses have to do?
It says 2 major things. First, businesses can and should use pesticides in order to protect against contamination via pests. After all, nobody wants a cockroach or something like that in their drink, right? And then the second part says that when they're not using pesticides, businesses have to carefully store those pesticides. They have to do so safely and in a manner that prevents against any kind of contamination.
You mentioned contamination. What is that?
That's what we at the FDA call the worst case scenario. It can have terrible consequences.
Objection, Your Honor. I'm going to be heard.
What is the legal basis of your objection?
To Rule 403, Your Honor, misleading the jury.
I'll hear your argument.
Yes, Your Honor. We have it on a good faith basis that this witness and the conclusions that he made in his investigations of Peony Estates were reliant on FDA codes and not the Midlands Building Code, Section 12-100. For this witness to go into the details of the Midlands Building Code as if these were the foundation that led him to his conclusions is misleading the jury because is misleading the jury on the grounds that it conflates the issues. It makes it seem as though the conclusions that he found during his inspection were reliant on the Midlands Building Code and not on the FDA codes, which he followed in this case.
May I respond, Your Honor?
Yes.
Mr. Finn can certainly clarify this on cross-examination, but in order for this testimony to be excluded under Rule 403 and Midland's Rules of Evidence, this testimony has to be substantially more misleading to the jury than any probative value it has. We're not connecting this to specific violations at Peony Estates. We're just laying out for the members of the jury exactly what the Midlands Building Code says that businesses have to do and what happens if they don't do that. This is extremely probative and has little to no prejudicial value in misleading the jury.
Is the basis of your claim of negligence per se this building code section?
Yes, Your Honor. The plaintiff contends that this is the section of Midland's Building Code that Peony Estates broke.
Mr. Finn, anything further?
Yes, Your Honor. Specifically, we also have an issue with this witness defining effectively what contamination is in this Midlands Building Code. If I may proffer, Your Honor, this witness is simply only aware of the Midlands Building Code and did not make any conclusions on it. For him to make a conclusion on the Midlands Building Code for the members of the jury, given that this is what their role is here to decide, well, that's effectively much or substantially more prejudicial than it is probative.
Mr. Finn, you'll have ample opportunity on cross-examination to explore those issues, and I would expect you'll do so. But for purposes of the direct examination, I'm going to allow this line of inquiry. You may continue, Ms. Hale.
Yes, Your Honor. Mr. O'Keefe, could you tell me what contamination is?
That's when any sort of product that's not supposed to be in food gets into food and makes it very, very dangerous.
What do you mean it makes it very, very dangerous?
People can get sick or even die from eating contaminated food or drinking contaminated drinks.
I'm now taking down that excerpt from Midland's building code. Mr. O'Keefe, I want to talk about a business that you may have investigated in the past. Have you heard of a place called Peony Estates?
Yes, indeed I have. I've actually been there several times over the course of my career.
I want to talk about one of the times that you visited Peony Estates. But first, would you mind telling the members of the jury a little bit about the business?
Of course. Peony Estates, it's located right here in Rapid River Valley. They're next to a swamp, which means they've had some problems with pests coming in from that swamp. So they use pesticides to combat those pests. They're also what we at the FDA call an in-house winery. And what that means is that they do all of their operations in-house. Everything from the growing of the grapes to the bottling of the wine is all done at Peony Estates by Peony Estates employees.
I want to talk about one of the times that you may have investigated Peony Estates. Were you ever at Peony Estates in 2019?
Yes, I was.
When was that?
That would have been on May 8th, I recall.
When you visited on May 8th of 2019, did you follow your three-step process?
Yes, I did, like I always do.
What did you find during your visual inspection of Peony Estates?
I found major code violations in the bottling room.
Does it matter that these violations occurred in the bottling room specifically?
Oh, yes, that's very, very important.
Why is that?
The bottling room is a particularly dangerous area. You know, think of it like this. My daughter wants to be an astronaut when she grows up. So imagine her in a spacesuit. A spacesuit is something that is completely sealed off from the external world and the environment outside of it. But when there's a rip or a tear in that spacesuit, any particles on the outside can come in. It's the same idea with wine in a bottling area. It's stored in casks that are sealed, exactly like a spacesuit. But when it leaves those casks, it's like a rip in that spacesuit. The seal is broken and the wine is exposed and open to any particles or contaminants that are in the air, which means it's a very, very dangerous place.
You mentioned that you found health code violations in this area. What exactly did you see in the bottling room?
There were several canisters of pesticides that were stored in the bottling room next to bottles of wine.
Did you notice anything special about any of these bottles of wine?
There was one in particular that was incredibly dangerous.
Why was that one particular bottle dangerous?
It was uncorked, completely unopened, and completely unsealed.
Can you describe this bottle of wine that you saw unsealed in the bottling room?
It was a red wine, and it was called Cara 2019.
What did you find at Peony Estates during your investigation step of your process?
Well, that second step involved me talking to the employees about why these pesticides were there and what we could do to fix it.
Did the employees know why the pesticides were there?
No, the employees seemed to be confused about the proper storage and procedure regarding the handling of pesticides.
Did the employees say anything else to you?
Yes, they did. When I instructed them to throw away that bottle of Cara wine because it could have been contaminated, they refused to do so.
Objection, Your Honor, to the statement that it could have been contaminated under Rule 702A and C.
And what do Rule 702A and C say?
Yes, Your Honor. Rule 702 itself is improper expert testimony, and Rule 702A specifically is regarding whether or not the expert's specialized knowledge will help a fact in this case or issue effectively become or effectively determine whether or not a fact or issue in this case is true. In this case, Your Honor, I have no issue with this witness determining whether or not violations at Peony Estates were made, given that that is his role as an FDA inspector, and those were the foundations that they laid when in explaining what his method was in this case. It was observations, interrogation, and follow-up. But to determine that the bottle was contaminated, despite despite only testifying to observations, laying no foundation of how any cross-contamination could be possible, would simply go against his expert knowledge as an FDA health inspector. Now, Rule 702C is regarding sufficient or reliable principles and methods. Again, his observations, interrogations, and follow-up are not sufficient methods to determine whether or not a bottle is likely or at all contaminated. He never tested the bottle of wine, and again, has no knowledge of how cross-contamination of a bottle of wine and pesticides is even possible.
Mr. Nelson, let me just clarify what I understood your statement to be, that it could have been contaminated. Am I correct, or did I hear incorrectly?
That is correct, Your Honor.
Okay. And Mr. Finn, the basis of your objection is as stated solely?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right. Ms. Hale, your response?
Your Honor, I agree with Mr. Finn that we have not laid the foundation for Mr. O'Keefe to be qualified as an expert, but that is not what this testimony requires. Mr. O'Keefe said that the bottle could have been contaminated based on his knowledge of Midland's law and contamination, which is already on the record. Mr. O'Keefe can absolutely testify to his rationally based perception in that bottle could have been contaminated.
Your Honor, if I may be heard on those grounds.
Yes.
I just want to be very clear. Is it counsel's contention today that this contamination conclusion was based on the Midlands Building Code?
Ms. Hale?
Yes, Your Honor. It's counsel's contention today that Mr. O'Keefe's statement that this bottle could have been contaminated was because of Peony Estates' violations of health codes and building codes. The things that Mr. O'Keefe saw in the bottling room led him to believe that this bottle could have been contaminated.
Your Honor, what I'm asking is if it's counsel's contention today that his conclusion was on the basis of the Midlands Building Code, because then, Your Honor, I would cite Kane Software Company v. Mars Investigations. Midlands does not permit parties to use their experts as weapons in trial by ambush or unfair surprise. Experts' reports that are exchanged prior to trial must contain a complete statement of all opinions the expert will testify to and the basis and the reasons for them, the facts or data considered by the expert informing their opinions, and the expert's qualifications. Your Honor, the defense has it on a good faith basis that the expert or that the FDA health inspector in this case only made conclusions based on FDA code. In their report, they only explicitly state that they are familiar with the Midlands Building Code, not that they made any conclusions based on it.
May I respond, Your Honor?
Yes.
Your Honor, once again, Mr. O'Keefe has not been qualified as an expert. Kane Software refers to expert testimony. Mr. O'Keefe is not making a conclusion. He's just saying that that bottle could have been contaminated.
Well, then, Your Honor, if I may be heard, apologies.
You may proceed.
Then, Your Honor, I would object to Rule 701 prong C to determine that this bottle of Carl wine might be contaminated would require a specialized knowledge for that to happen. Now, that was the basis of my original objection, under the impression that they were qualifying Adkins O'Keefe as an expert. If they're not doing so, then this opinion cannot come in as a lay witness opinion because it requires a specialized knowledge.
Your objection is sustained.
Mr. O'Keefe, did the employees say anything else to you?
Yes, they told me that it wasn't their job to move any sort of wine or pesticide, that it was actually someone else's job.
What did you do in your third step of your process, follow-up?
I knew that things couldn't continue the way they were going. I needed to make sure that things got back on the right track. So I took an admittedly drastic but necessary step. I put Peony Estates on probation and said that they had to fix their problems, get back on the right track, or else they would be at risk to lose their license to produce wine.
No further questions, Your Honor.
Thank you, Mr. Finney Cross.
Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Atkins O'Keefe, I'd like to walk us through your inspection on May 8th of 2019, if that's all right.
Of course.
Now, you testified that you found several canisters of pesticides in the bottling, right?
Yes, that's right.
And this was largely the basis for why you cited Peony Estates for the location of this pesticide, correct?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent summary of my visit.
All right. Now, I want to be very clear. You don't know how long these pesticide canisters were in the bottling room.
Yes, that seems right. I didn't actually count them or look at security cameras or anything like that.
Okay. And you obviously never saw the canisters leaking, right?
Oh, goodness, no. That would have been a real cause for concern. I might have had to call for backup then if I saw that.
And you never saw any of the employees obviously using these canisters around the bottle of wine in question, correct?
Yes, that's also true.
Okay, now I want to move on to your role here today, Mr. Atkins O'Keefe. Now, you're, as testified, a designated inspector for the FDA, right?
Yes, that's correct. I take great pride in my work.
So your job, if I'm understanding it correctly, is to determine whether or not businesses are violating FDA code.
Yes, you've summarized my duties perfectly.
Okay, now you are familiar with the Midlands Building Code, correct?
Yes, sometimes we at the FDA have to send inspectors to other departments or other things like that. And so it's important that we know all the relevant codes.
At this time, Your Honor, the defense is now sharing Midlands Building Code, Section 12-100. Mr. Atkins O'Keefe, this is that code that I was referencing earlier.
Yeah, it looks just like it.
And since you're familiar with both codes, the FDA and the Midlands Building Code, would it be fair for me to say that the FDA code, the language of the FDA code, is not explicitly the same language of the Midlands Building Code?
I think that'd be fair to say. I mean, after all, they're not carbon copies of each other.
Right. Now, I want to go back to some of those violations you made on your May 8th inspection. You cited Peony Estates for improper employee training, correct?
Yes, that's true.
Now, to be very clear, the Midlands Building Code makes no explicit mention of how employees are supposed to be trained, right?
I suppose that's right, yes, but it does talk about the safe procedures and handling of pesticides, and that's certainly relevant to employee training.
Right, but to be very clear, it doesn't tell employees where they're supposed to store pesticides, correct?
Yes, that's true. That's left up to us as the inspectors.
It doesn't say whether or not a specific room is where the pesticides have to be.
Yes, that's also right.
It doesn't state that the pesticides have to be stored at a specific distance from all food or food processing areas.
Yes, that's also true. It's a generally vague code.
Right. Now, the basis for why you found an issue with Peony Estates' pesticide location was that it was within 50 feet of food and food processing areas, correct?
That's not quite right, sir.
Can you elaborate then for me, Mr. Atkins O'Keefe?
Well, I had visited Peony Estates about a year prior, and at that point, the employees were actually storing pesticides.
Mr. Atkins O'Keefe, can I stop you right there? I'm really just talking about our May 8th inspection. If counsel wants to talk about any of your previous inspections, that's fine, but I would really like us to focus on the May 8th inspection and the violations you made on that date.
Yes, my apologies.
Mr. Atkins O'Keefe, I just want to be very clear that the violations you cited Peony Estates for in regards to their storage of pesticides was because they were within 50 feet of food processing areas and food, correct?
My apologies, but the 50 feet rule was not what I was using on May 8th. I was using it in my previous visit, but it was the proximity, not any specific distance rule that mattered on that visit.
So it's your testimony under oath today that the 50-foot rule played no part in one of your violations you cited Peony Estates for, correct?
Yes, it's the fact that the pesticide canisters were in such close proximity. The number 50 feet didn't matter. It's the fact that they were in the same room.
At this time, Your Honor, I would now like to share the witness's affidavit for the purposes of impeachment.
Very
A
well.
report, apologies. Mr. Atkins O'Keefe, this is a fair and accurate copy of the report you made for the FDA.
Just from the little slice that I'm seeing, it looks like it.
Right, and you intended to be entirely truthful in this statement or in this report, correct?
Of course.
You were instructed to include all relevant information when you compiled this report.
Yes, that's right.
And you knew you had up until the point of trial today to update this report with any new information.
Yes, that is what I was told.
Trial technician, if you could scroll down to page 13, correct?
Objection, Your Honor. I just ask that Mr. Finn show the entirety of Mr. O'Keefe's report so we can make sure that this is an accurate copy before reading off of the report.
Very well. Ms. Hale, are you satisfied?
As long as Mr. O'Keefe can confirm that this is his report in its entirety, then I am.
Mr. Atkins O'Keefe, is this your report in its entirety?
Yes, it looks to be.
Trial technician, if you could scroll up to page 13. Actually, can you scroll a bit higher so we can get the exact date of when this inspection was made? Just up a few pages. Thank you. Mr. Atkins O'Keefe, this is the report you made in your May 8th inspection of Peony Estates.
Yes, that's right.
And now, trial technician, can you scroll down to page 13? Or page 13, please, just a little bit lower. Mr. Atkins O'Keefe, these are the violations you cited Peony Estates for, these 4 prongs right here, correct?
That's not quite right.
What are these prongs, Mr. Atkins O'Keefe?
Well, those are the guiding principles that the FDA puts at the end of every single report. It's essentially a list of things that we have to look for. But a little up further in the report, I actually specifically mention the pesticides, and that's where I talk about the proximity and the fact that they're in the same room being the issue.
Mr. Atkins O'Keefe, you write in this report specifically that pesticides are only dedicated in storage space that is at minimum 50 feet from any food or beverage production or storage space. Now, you testified on cross-examination to me that this played no part in your violation or in the violations you cited Peony Estates for, correct?
Yes, because the violation wasn't about the storage facility or space. It was the fact that they were in the same room.
Thank you, Mr. Atkins O'Keefe. I have no further questions at this time.
Thank you. Ms. Hale, any redirect?
No redirect, Your Honor. May Mr. O'Keefe be excused?
Yes, thank you, Mr. O'Keefe.
Thank you.
And plaintiff, you may call your next witness.
Yes, Your Honor. At this time, the plaintiff calls Casey Soto to the stand. May I proceed?
Yes.
Could you please introduce yourself to the members of the jury?
Yeah, hi. My name is Casey Soto.
What do you do for a living?
Currently, I work as a gardener. I have always really loved growing plants, and the work that I've done on my volunteering for my mother's winery has always lended me well to helping harvest crops.
Now, you just said that your mother has a winery. Who's your mother?
My mother is Harper Martini.
What winery does she own?
She owns Peony Estates. It's a winery right here in Midlands.
What are you doing here today?
I'm here because of the death of my fiance, Genesis Petrillo.
Could you tell us a little bit more about your relationship with Genesis?
Yeah, Genesis and we went to this house party and we had a ping pong duel, and we were tied and she accidentally hit me in the face with a ping pong ball. And we both agreed that the only acceptable recompense was that we go on a date afterwards to smooth things out. And after that, I mean, one date turned into 2, and we just we fell in love.
You told us that Genesis was your fiance. When were you going to be married?
We were going to be married on June 8th of 2019 at my mother's winery, Peony Estates.
Before we talk about your wedding, I want to talk a little bit more about Peony Estates. Did you ever spend any time working there?
Yeah, not as an official employee, of course, but growing up, it was always sort of expected that I would help out around the family business. So I spent summers volunteering, quotation marks, over there.
Would you recognize a map of Peony Estates if I were to show one to you?
I absolutely would. I know that place like the back of my hand.
Now screen sharing what has previously been entered as Exhibit 4. Is this a fair and accurate depiction of a map of Peony Estates?
Yes, it is.
Now, I have to ask, do you know if Peony Estates uses pesticides?
Yes, they do. They use them on the grapes.
Prior to your wedding, did you ever have any conversations with the owner, your mother, about pesticides?
Yes, we did. There was one particular conversation in which we talked about a massive leak that had happened in the storage barn where a bunch of pesticides are kept.
Objection, Your Honor, to lack of foundation. May I be heard?
As to which part of her statement?
As to the leak in the storage barn of Peony Estates.
I'll hear your argument.
Now, we have it on a good faith basis that the winery experienced this leak in 2017. This leak was then corrected when a new storage shed was built in July of 2018. We have it on a good faith basis that the grapes that were produced in the 2019 Carl wine, the wine that is in question in today's court, were not actually harvested until a month after that new shed had been built in August of 2018. We've heard no foundation from Mix Soto here about whether or not this Carl wine was even in production at the time of this, quote, giant leak in the storage facility. If we have no foundation that the Carl wine was even in production at this time, these events are clearly outside of the relevant time period of today's case and are irrelevant without that foundation.
Ms. Klinkhammer, your response?
Yes, Your Honor. First, I'd like to note that this witness is not going to be going into any specifics about this massive leak. May I make an offer of proof?
Yes.
What this witness is actually going to talk about is that this storage barn that pesticides were stored in, what happened after that massive leak, where these pesticides were moved to. We're not going into any specifics about the massive leak in the storage barn. Therefore, this witness does not have to lay any foundation about that.
May I respond?
Yes.
In that case, I'd like to amend my objection to character evidence. If opposing counsel is attempting to elicit testimony that talks about the practices and what we have on a good faith basis will be violations of Peony Estates pesticide storage, she will be eliciting those based on 2017 data and 2017 facts. Again, this was before the Carl wine was ever in production. If I could direct your attention to case law DeBell v. Olafson and Farrow LLP from 1995, this case law does state that in a products liability case such as today, all instances of negligence are relevant and are not used for propensity if they are within the time frame that that product was being produced. Now, everything that Mix Soto is about to testify here to happened before the relevant time period in today's case, and thus is being used for propensity evidence.
All right. Final response from plaintiff?
Yes, Your Honor. The piece of case law that Ms. Paxton just read from Dybel v. Olafson actually says that acts and practices can still be considered part of the case at hand, even if said acts and practices occurred years prior, so long as the acts and practices can plausibly be connected to the case at hand. In this case, if we're talking about the pesticide storage, these pesticides being moved to another room is connected to the case at hand.
The objection will be overruled, but you may explore the issue on cross-examination.
Now, Mick Soto, you were talking about the storage barn. Could you explain more about what happens in the storage barn?
Yes, the storage barn is essentially where a bunch of a variety of different tools and such are kept. Harper and I, we had this conversation in 2018, and we talked about how there was a huge leak and a bunch of things had to be moved from the storage barn.
I'm not going to mark that storage barn on the map. Now, where were these things moved to after this leak?
Everything in the storage barn was moved, including the pesticides. They were all moved into the bottling area in the main building.
I'm now going to mark on the map where the bottling area is. What types of things happen in the bottling area?
Well, that's essentially where casks of wine are brought in, and the wine in those casks are poured into various bottles that are then sealed and shipped off to people who will buy the wine.
Now I want to move to talking about your wedding. And I understand that this might be hard to talk about, so if at any point you need to take a break, feel free to do so. But can you start by telling us about that weekend?
Yeah. Genesis and I, we drove up to Peony Estates and we had a wedding rehearsal on June 7th. We ran through the ceremony itself, and that was fine. I mean, I accidentally stepped on the train of Genesis's wedding gown, and a button popped off my suit. But better the day before than the actual day of. And then we got to the rehearsal dinner.
What was planned for the rehearsal dinner?
Well, we ate supper, of course. Genesis and I, we fed each other off each other's plates. We would, we pulled the whole Lady and the Tramp kind of deal. And then we got to the toasts, which were just beautiful, especially my mom's.
Can you tell us about your mom's toast?
Yeah, she talked about how much she loved me, and she presented Genesis with this beautiful bottle of wine. It was uncorked, and it was a 2019 Cara.
Did anybody else receive a bottle of 2019 Cara?
No, it was just Genesis. In fact, I've never seen any other bottles of that 2019 Cara, just that one that was given to Genesis.
Did you see Genesis drink any of that Cara wine?
She did. She poured the 2 glasses and she drank at least one of them.
How did the rest of that weekend go?
I mean, that night I kissed Genesis goodnight, and I went upstairs and I fell asleep. It was the last time that I ever saw her alive.
What happened when you woke up that next morning, the day of your wedding?
I woke up and I heard that Genesis was in the hospital. And I tried to get there as fast as I could, but it was too late. 5 minutes before I had even stepped foot in the lobby, she was gone. I didn't even get to say goodbye.
Did you ever receive a copy of Genesis's death certificate?
Yes, I wanted to know what happened to her.
What did that death certificate list as her cause of death?
It said that she died from pesticide poisoning.
Thank you, Mick Soto, for your testimony. Your Honor, I have no further questions at this time.
Thank you, Ms. Paxson. Your cross?
Yes, Your Honor. First, the defense will be screen sharing that same map of the Peony Estates winery.
Very well.
Mick Soto, on direct examination, you talked about a leak that happened in the storage shed, circled here on this map.
Um, actually, it was in the storage barn. There's a storage shed and there's a storage barn. They're two separate buildings.
And this leak happened in the storage barn, correct?
Yes, that's where it happened.
To be clear, you would agree that you talked to your mother about this leak back in 2018?
Yes, it was in the latter half. I know that, I don't remember the exact date, but I know that Genesis proposed on July 18th, and this was during the wedding planning process. So it would have had to have been in the latter half of the year.
Now, on direct examination, you mentioned that your mother would have to move everything from this storage barn to the bottling room in Peony Estates. Is that correct?
Yes, that's what she said that she was going to do.
Now, she said that she would only have to move everything to this bottling room if she was unable to fix the leak in the storage barn, right?
Yes, she said that it would be very expensive and she would have to raise enough money to repair the storage barn.
She indicated to you that she would have to move everything to the bottling room only if she was unable to repair this damage. Is that correct, Ms. Soto?
I think when what she said was that they would start with relocating things and then they would move them back once they made enough profit to warrant the repairs, that's what she said.
Now, you never saw anyone actually moving anything from this storage shed into the bottling room, did you?
That's true. I never saw anything like that.
You never saw anyone move anything out of this storage barn at all, right?
No, honestly, I wasn't paying attention to that kind of thing. I was focused on my wedding.
You said that your mother, she had to change the way that she stored pesticides.
I'm sorry, I don't know what you mean. During that conversation or later?
After an inspection in May of 2019, she indicated to you that she had to change the way that she stored her pesticides. Is that correct?
Yes.
To be clear, after that conversation with your mother in May of 2019, you never saw pesticides in that bottling room, right?
No, honestly, I never went in there.
You never saw pesticides inside any of the Peony Estates facilities after that?
No, I didn't go in there. I don't know if they were in there.
You personally never saw pesticides near any of Peony Estates wine?
I never saw something like that, no.
And after your mother told you that she needed to change the way that she stored pesticides in May of 2019, you never saw any pesticides on Peony Estates property at all. Is that correct?
Yeah, I don't remember seeing anything like that.
I want to move ahead to the night of your rehearsal dinner. You were not with your fiance, Genesis, that whole night, were you?
I wasn't. I wish I was. Maybe then I could have stopped what happened.
You went to bed before your fiance?
Yes.
Ms. Soto, I know this is difficult, but you are unable to tell us if Genesis ate anything after you went to bed?
I don't know.
And you are unable to tell us if Genesis drank anything after you went to bed. Is that correct?
Like I said, I don't know what happened.
Thank you for your time, Ms. Soto. I have no further questions at this time, Your Honor.
Thank you, Ms. Paxson. Any redirect?
No redirect, Your Honor. We just asked that Ms. Soto be allowed to step down.
All right. Thank you, Ms. Soto. And if you'd give me just a moment to finish scoring here. Right. Plaintiff, you may call your next witness.
Plaintiff calls Dr. Quan. May I proceed?
Yes.
Please state your name.
Hello, my name is Dr. Jimin Quan.
What do you do for a living?
Currently, I'm the chief emergency room physician at Rapid River Valley Hospital.
What does that job entail?
Well, when patients come into an emergency room, I'm the one that gets to examine them, admit them into the hospital, and go on to treat them.
You mentioned that this is your current job. How long have you been working in the medical field?
I've been working in the medical field for about 20 years now. Ever since I graduated from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, I did a residency at Emory. And then since then, I've been in emergency rooms across the nation, the past 5 being at Rapid River.
Do you have any specialties?
Yes, I do. I'm specialized and actually board certified in toxicology.
What is toxicology?
Toxicology is just the study of how toxins affect the human body. What I see in the emergency room is usually a college student having a little too much to drink or a 6-year-old eating something they shouldn't have.
Well, doctor, why is it that you're here testifying in court today?
Well, on June 8th, Genesis Petrillo came into the emergency room and I was their treating physician.
Were you able to diagnose Ms. Petrillo?
Yes, I was.
Well, what sorts of information or facts did you have?
Well, I had observations that I had of Ms. Petrillo on June 8th, along with tests conducted on her body and subsequent tests that were given to me before coming here today.
And what sort of process did you take to treat Ms. Petrillo?
I did what we call a standard diagnosis in the emergency room. When a patient comes in, I examine their symptoms, come to suspicions on what they might be suffering from. From there, I use tests to confirm those suspicions, and then I go on to diagnose and treat the patient.
Is that how you'd go about treating any patient who came to you in the ER?
Yes, it is. It's not only how I do it, it's how my colleagues around the country do it.
Is it reliable?
Yes, it's been peer-reviewed many times.
And did you reliably follow that process when treating Ms. Petrillo?
Yes, I did.
Well, you mentioned that you were able to diagnose Ms. Petrillo. What did you diagnose her with?
I diagnosed her with pesticide poisoning caused by contaminated wine in the stomach.
Objection, Your Honor, on grounds of 702, specifically subsection B, which would be opinions by an expert witness, if I may be heard.
Yes.
So prong B describes sufficient facts or data that this doctor would have relied upon in reaching their conclusion. In order to properly make the determination that red wine was the vessel or contaminant within Ms. Petrillo's system, the doctor needs to be relying on sufficient facts and data. Now, when Dr. Quan walked us through all of the evidence or materials that he had, he failed to mention the affidavit of Angel Rodriguez. Now, within that affidavit, it describes in detail multiple liquids or drinks that Ms. Petrillo consumed that night. Now, we have it on a good faith basis that not only did this doctor have this knowledge and evidence available, they also failed to utilize it. This doctor, in continuing testimony, will most likely tell you that the only liquid they were able to identify within Ms. Petrillo's system was red wine. Now, we have not heard any evidence of, one, these other liquids even existing, and two, how these other liquids were eliminated as a source of these pesticides.
Ms. Hunsinger, your response?
Yes, Your Honor, we have laid all the sufficient foundation for Dr. Quan to elicit this opinion. Further, under Rule 705, the doctor is allowed to disclose his conclusions prior to giving the underlying facts and data, for which he will, as we go on in the direct, explain how it is that he came to that determination. Further, Your Honor, under Stipulation 3, as has been pointed out during pretrial, exhibits 1 through 10 have been pre-admitted. One of those exhibits, Exhibit 7, includes the death certificate of Genesis Petrillo, in which Dr. Quan lists this exact testimony. This is a statement that has already been on the record, and we already have the foundation.
I believe that the objection goes to weight rather than admissibility. Also, Ms. Johnson, if your contention is that insufficient facts or data have been proffered to support the opinion, I would expect you to explore that on cross-examination. The objection is overruled.
Dr. Quan, I want to take a step back to allow the members of the jury to understand how it is you came to that diagnosis. First, how did Ms. Petrillo become one of your patients?
Well, in the early morning of June 8th, EMTs rushed Ms. Petrillo into my care.
What was her condition like?
Well, when Ms. Petrillo came in, I was noticing some common signs of some type of poisoning. She was vomiting, had slurred speech. She was complaining about stomach pains, and she was even falling in and out of consciousness. These are classic signs of poisoning, and because of that, I admitted her into the hospital.
What did you do after admitting Ms. Petrillo to the hospital?
Well, when we're looking at poisoning cases, we usually want to determine what type of poisoning the patient might be suffering from. And how we do that is we look at the patient's symptoms. So when I looked a little closer at Ms. Petrillo's symptoms, I noticed a unique combination that led me to believe pesticide poisoning.
What was that unique combination?
Well, first, when we look at the pupils, I saw excessive tearing, constricted pupils, along with a slowed pulse and even involuntary muscle twitching. It's because of not only these symptoms, but the combination of them that led me to believe this was a pesticide poisoning case.
Doctor, what happened after you made that determination?
Well, after I made that determination, I decided to order some tests on Ms. Petrillo to confirm those suspicions, but also knowing the lack of time we had in the emergency room, I went on to go treat Ms. Petrillo.
Well, what was that treatment like?
Well, with the hospital's best efforts, we tried to treat her for pesticide poisoning, but Ms. Petrillo unfortunately passed away due to respiratory arrest, just a failure of the lungs.
Doctor, earlier you testified that you ran some tests on Ms. Petrillo. When did you get those test results?
I actually got those tests after Ms. Petrillo passed away and just when I was writing her death certificate.
Were they helpful in coming to that determination that Ms. Petrillo did suffer from pesticide poisoning?
Yes, one test in particular especially. It was a test of Ms. Petrillo's blood and stomach contents.
Would you recognize that test if I were to show it to you?
Yes, I would.
We're now sharing to the screen Exhibit 6, a previously admitted exhibit. Doctor, is this that same toxicology report about Genesis Petrillo?
Yes, it is. It's just a test of Ms. Petrillo's blood and stomach contents for some type of toxin.
Were any toxins found?
Yes, in both the blood and stomach, they found the presence of isofenfos pesticides.
Are you able to determine the source of those pesticides?
Yes, when I looked at all the findings in Ms. Petrillo's stomach, I noted a high content of wine in Ms. Petrillo's stomach mixed in with those pesticides.
Doctor, is there any possibility that food that Ms. Petrillo consumed that night could have caused this?
While it's technically possible, it's highly unlikely. Due to the testing on Ms. Petrillo's stomach, we never found any other possible source that could have caused this.
I want to focus then on that wine. When reviewing facts for the case of Genesis Petrillo, you remember reviewing any reports about a bottle of wine?
Yes, I actually received a test on a bottle of wine from Peony Estates.
Would you recognize that test if I were to show it to you?
Yes, I would.
We're now sharing to the screen Exhibit 10, which has been previously admitted. Doctor, is this that same report about a bottle of wine from Peony Estates that you're referring to?
Yes, it is.
Do you know what wine bottle is being tested?
In the notes at the bottom, it says it's an empty bottle of Cara wine.
Was anything found in that bottle of Cara wine?
Yes, along with trace amounts of wine, they did find the presence of isofenfos pesticides.
Doctor, are those the same type of pesticides found in Miss Petrillo's system?
Yes, the exact same.
Thank you, doctor. I have no further questions.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. You're cross.
Yes, Your Honor. So, Dr. Quan, first I want to talk about some things you discussed on direct examination. You made the conclusion that the contaminants in Miss Petrillo's system were due to wine, correct?
Yes.
And in your process of reviewing Miss Petrillo's case, you had available to you the affidavit of Angel Rodriguez, correct?
Yes, before coming here today, I was given that.
Within that affidavit, we understand that Miss Petrillo consumed tequila, champagne, and liquid from a flask, correct?
Objection to hearsay.
Your Honor, may I respond?
Yes.
Yes, Your Honor. So according to Rule 703, which is in regards to expert testimony, it states that if experts in the particular field would reasonably rely on those kinds of facts or data in forming an opinion on the subject, those facts need not be admissible for the opinion to be admitted.
May I respond?
Yes.
Your Honor, pursuant to case law on page 3, Richards v. Mississippi Barbecue, it states that Midland's Rules of Evidence 703 does not permit experts to testify in a manner that simply summarizes inadmissible hearsay without first relating that hearsay to some specialized knowledge on the expert's part. As such, this knowledge of Angel Rodriguez's statements would have to be connected to some sort of conclusion that the doctor made. Now, Dr. Quan did not use these statements when coming to his conclusion that Genesis Petrillo died of pesticide poisoning from contaminated wine. As such, this is hearsay.
May I respond on those grounds?
Yes, Ms. Johnson.
Yes, counsel is failing to recognize that not only can inadmissible hearsay be brought in to support a conclusion, but to show lack thereof support in a conclusion. Now, Dr. Quan has explained to us that by finding red wine in Miss Petrillo's system, he subsequently concluded that red wine was the contaminant. However, has failed to include the other evidence that indicated other liquids in Miss Petrillo's stomach, as well as how he was able to properly eliminate those separate chemicals, those separate liquids. My apologies.
The objection is overruled. I believe it's appropriate for cross-examination of this expert.
So, Dr. Quan, within that affidavit, it stated that Miss Petrillo consumed tequila shots, champagne, and an unidentified liquid from a flask, correct?
Yes to the champagne in the flask, but there was actually uncertainty about the tequila.
However, Dr. Quan, I have your report in front of me, and it appears that you failed to mention any of those three liquids within it, correct?
We were never able to identify those liquids besides the wine.
So in your inability to single out those liquids, you made the determination that they could not have been the contaminant, correct?
That along with other facts.
Now, you'd agree with me, and you state yourself that it's possible these other liquids that you weren't able to identify could have caused the positive result, correct?
Yes, while technically possible, it is highly unlikely.
However, you did not investigate these alternate theories whatsoever within this report, correct?
Well, when we tested the stomach, we only found pesticides in the contaminated wine.
Now, in addition to these unidentified liquids, you also agree that it's possible that dissolved stomach contents or food that Miss Petrillo may have consumed that night also could have caused this positive result, correct?
Yes, again, it's possible.
Now, you received a test that you discussed on direct examination labeled as Exhibit 10, correct?
Yes, I did.
And you told the court during direct examination that this test was completed on an empty bottle, right?
Yes.
Now, that test that you walked us through, it's unfortunately not able to tell us what time that empty bottle would have come into contact with those pesticides, correct?
No.
And when reviewing the dates on the top portion of that exhibit, it wasn't tested until a day after the rehearsal dinner, correct?
I believe so.
And it also states that that bottle was found in the trash, doesn't it?
Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Quan. I have no further questions at this time. However, Your Honor, I would ask to use a portion of my cross-examination time to read a stipulation onto the record.
Very well.
Stipulation 17 states that a canister of bug-off pesticide was also found in the same dumpster in which Rapid River Police Department found exhibits 2A and 2B, which are photographs of the Cara wine bottle depicted in exhibit 10. Thank you. And with that, I have nothing further at this time.
Thank you, Ms. Hunsinger. Any redirect?
No further questions for this witness, but the plaintiff would like to read onto a stipulation onto the record.
You have the same opportunity then as Ms. Johnson.
Yes, Your Honor. Pursuant to stipulation 9, all leftover food and beverages, alcoholic and otherwise, from June 7th of 2019 rehearsal dinner were tested, and those found no organophosphate or other poisons or abnormalities. With that, we ask that Dr. Quan be excused.
Thank you, Dr. Quan, for your testimony. Anything further for plaintiff?
Nothing further from the plaintiff. We rest our case in chief and ask for just a brief 5-minute recess.
5-minute recess it is. We'll reconvene then. Thank you. Looks like our 5 minutes are up. Is everyone ready to proceed?
Plaintiff is ready to proceed.
Defense?
Defense is present and ready to proceed as well.
All right, then, Ms. Johnson, you may call the first defense witness.
Yes, Your Honor. The defense calls Dr. Reginald Cannon. May I proceed?
Yes.
Good morning, Dr. Cannon. Could you start by introducing yourself?
My name is Dr. Reginald Cannon, and I work as an associate medical consultant for Gardner Consulting Incorporated. We're based out of Beverly Hills, California.
How are you qualified for that position?
I graduated from the Ohio State University in 1990, which is where I earned my Bachelor of Science in Chemistry with honors before going on to Harvard Medical School, which is where I earned my medical degree in 1996. From there, I began working at Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston as the chief toxicologist before taking a faculty position at Midlands Medical School. After that, I started the job I have now.
So what exactly do you do as a medical consultant?
Essentially, I review other physicians' conclusions regarding a host of elements, such as cause of death, time of death, and manner of death.
Could you describe that process a little bit more intensely for the members of the jury?
Of course, I review all available evidence. I review publications and peer-reviewed articles pertaining to the relevant medical principles, apply my own knowledge and expertise, and come to my own conclusions.
So is your work as a consultant how you're related to today's trial?
Yes, I was hired by Peony Estates' legal team to review the work of one Jim and Quan, specifically with regards to the conclusions about the cause of death of Genesis Petrillo.
Now, you just mentioned to us previously that reviewing materials is a fairly large portion of your reviewing process here. So what kinds of materials were available for Ms. Petrillo's case?
Yes, I reviewed Dr. Quan's full report. I also reviewed a toxins analysis of a bottle of Cara wine and a toxins analysis of the subject's blood and stomach contents. Furthermore, I reviewed the affidavit of an eyewitness.
Now, did you apply this analysis method in the same way for Ms. Petrillo's case that you have all past and similar cases?
Yes, ma'am.
And those materials that you just walked us through, were those sufficient for you to reach your conclusions today?
Yes, they were.
So following your analysis of the initial doctor's findings, was there anything you found concerning?
Dr. Quan concluded that the subject died from pesticide poisoning through the ingestion of contaminated wine. I agree that pesticides are the most likely cause of death. However, there's simply insufficient evidence to be sure that the source of the pesticide contamination was the 2019 Cara wine.
What would it take to determine a contaminant?
There are many variables that must be considered to make that classification. I actually brought along a visual aid to help explain those variables, if it's all right with you, ma'am.
Your Honor, does the doctor have permission to display his visual aid in order to aid the jury's understanding of his testimony today?
Of course.
Dr. Cannon, could you just start by explaining what we've got in front of us here?
Yes, of course. In order to make an affirmative classification for a source of contamination, there are 6 factors that must first be considered, which is what you see before you hear.
So how about we just start in the upper left-hand corner, or what would be my upper left-hand corner of this screen, labeled pesticide found in the system. What does that mean?
Our first piece is pretty self-explanatory. We would need to find evidence of pesticides in the subject's system, which there was.
Moving on to the middle piece in that first row, analysis of Cara wine. Could you explain that?
Yes. Next, we would have to run a toxins analysis on the physical 2019 Cara wine, which Dr. Quan asserts was the vehicle of contamination. Unfortunately, this was a missing piece.
Now, what about the third puzzle piece in that first row? Evidence of red wine ingested.
This piece is also pretty basic. We would need to have evidence of the ingestion of red wine in the subject's stomach contents.
Did you have that?
Yes, ma'am.
So moving on to the second row of this puzzle, farthest to the left, what's that piece? Analysis of unidentified liquids.
Yes, this piece is possibly the most important. We would need to be able to analyze any liquids consumed that were unable to be identified in the stomach contents.
Why would this piece have been the most important?
We know that the subject drank wine, champagne, and an unidentified liquid from a flask. Due to the way the stomach breaks its contents down, just because a liquid's unable to be identified in the stomach doesn't mean it isn't present. Dr. Quan was unable to identify these additional liquids and took that to mean they weren't present. This mistake has resulted in us being unable to analyze these additional beverages.
Moving on to the piece directly right of that one, analysis of food remnants. Why was this significant?
In an attempt to rule out contamination by way of food, we would have to analyze any food remnants within the subject's stomach contents. Luckily, such a test was available for review.
So what's the final piece of this puzzle, Dr. Cannon?
We would need an analysis of all ingested food from that night, whether it had been digested or not. Unfortunately, that evidence was also missing.
Well, Dr. Cannon, I thought that there was a test completed on all leftover food from the rehearsal dinner.
Well, there was an analysis of the leftover food. Unfortunately, it's not very informative to only test food that wasn't consumed. Anything containing pesticides that had been fully consumed can't be tested, so we can't complete this part of the puzzle.
When you put everything that you've told us just now with this puzzle together, what exactly does it mean?
This tells me that there's simply too many missing pieces to conclude that the pesticides came from the 2019 car of wine. Based on the evidence present, there is no possible way to determine with scientific certainty the source of the pesticide contamination within Genesis Petrillo's system.
Thank you, Dr. Cannon. Your Honor, I have no further questions at this time.
Thank you. Ms. Hunsinger, you're cross?
Yes, Your Honor, may I proceed?
Yes.
Doctor, you and I can both agree that pesticides are dangerous, right?
Yes, they can certainly be dangerous.
If somebody were to consume pesticides, well, that could have consequences.
Yes, it could have consequences.
Now I want to focus on what you just talked about. You talked about the source of contamination in this case, right?
Yes.
You would agree with me that there's two ways that a person can ingest pesticides, right?
Yes.
One way would be to directly ingest it.
Yes.
And the other way, well, that would be to eat a food or have a beverage that had pesticides in it, correct?
Yes.
Talking about that direct ingestion, well, you'd agree with me that you find that to be highly unlikely in the case of Genesis Petrillo, right?
Yes, it's possible, though highly unlikely, that Genesis ingested pesticide on its own.
So it's more likely then that Genesis ate a food or beverage that had pesticides in it, true?
Yes. The issue is the source of that contamination is unclear based on the evidence at hand.
I actually want to focus on that. You'd agree with me that Genesis Petrillo was at a wedding rehearsal the night before she died.
Yes, she was.
You're aware that there was a buffet at that wedding rehearsal, true?
Yes, there was a buffet.
Presumably other people at that wedding rehearsal were eating off that buffet, right?
Yes, that would stand to reason.
You'd agree with me that Genesis Petrillo was the only wedding rehearsal guest that you're aware of that got sick, right?
Yes, that's true.
Let's talk about why that is. It's true that Genesis Petrillo, well, she had a test on her stomach and blood, right?
Yes, that's true.
You've actually reviewed that test before.
Yes, I did.
You're aware that that test found a presence of wine in Miss Petrillo's stomach, right?
Yes, though we know based on the affidavit of Angel Rodriguez, there is also additional liquids in the stomach that weren't tested. So we can't be sure that the wine is the source of contamination, because if the wine is found to have pesticides in it in the stomach, that can very easily be due to the natural mixing of everything within the stomach.
Dr. Cannon, I understand that, but I'm just looking for a yes or no here. Genesis Petrillo had wine in her stomach, yes or no?
Yes,
Yes or no, doctor, she also had pesticides in her stomach, right?
yes, the stomach contents tested positive for containing pesticides.
And you're aware Genesis Petrillo did in fact drink wine the night before she died, correct?
Yes, I'm aware she drank wine, she consumed other beverages, and she also consumed food, all of which could have been contaminated with pesticides.
And specifically, doctor, yes or no, she drank the Cara wine, right?
Yes, I believe she drank a wine labeled Cara.
You're aware that that Cara bottle of wine, it also tested positive for pesticides, true?
The empty bottle in the trash did test positive for containing pesticides, though we don't know if the pesticides found on the bottle while in the trash were there before they were put in the trash while Genesis was drinking that wine.
Doctor, you would agree with me that there is compelling evidence that that Cara wine contained pesticides, yes or no?
There's not enough evidence to be certain that the Cara wine contained pesticides.
Doctor, I'm not asking you if you can be certain. I'm asking whether or not there's compelling evidence. And there is, isn't there?
Ma'am, I can't give you a yes or no when it comes to science. When it comes to science and medical testing, there's so many possibilities. One could argue there's compelling evidence for one part, but we simply don't have enough evidence to be sure that the Cara wine was positive for containing pesticides due to it being in the stomach where there was other liquids that could have very well contained pesticides as well as other solids.
Doctor, I'm looking for a yes or no to this next question. Is it your testimony today that there was not compelling evidence that that wine contained pesticides? Yes or no?
Yes, there was compelling evidence.
Now I want to focus on your most likely conclusion. You would agree with me it's most likely Genesis Petrillo died of respiratory arrest, right?
Yes, that is the most likely cause of death.
And it's most likely she died of pesticide poisoning. Yes or no?
Yes.
Thank you. I have no further questions.
My apologies. Any redirect, Ms. Johnson?
No, Your Honor. This witness, we are completed with this witness.
All right. Thank you, doctor. And defense, you may call your next witness.
Yes, Your Honor. The defense calls Austin Lewis. Can you please state your name for the record?
Austin Lewis.
Mr. Lewis, can you tell the members of the jury a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I grew up here in Midlands, where most people just live on a farm. Luckily, though, I was able to grow up around wine. My mother even owned her own winery, and I ended up becoming a head winemaker here in Midlands myself. I guess you could say wine just sort of runs in the family.
How are you involved in today's case?
Well, unfortunately, I was the head winemaker at Peony Estates at the time of Genesis Petrillo's death.
Well, as a head winemaker, are you required to follow any rules or safety guidelines in order to ensure that your wine is actually safe?
Of course. We work with both the general FDA codes as well as the Midlands building codes to ensure that everything we do at Peony Estates is done safely, from wine production to pest control.
At this time, Your Honor, does the defense have permission to share Midlands Building Code subsection 12-100?
Yes.
Mr. Lewis, what is this document?
This is a section of the Midlands Building Code talking about pest control and pesticide use. Specifically, this is a section about the safe use of pesticides that you have highlighted there.
At this time, Your Honor, does the defense have permission to share Midlands Building Code subsection 12-100?
This is a section about the safe use of pesticides that you have highlighted there. Specifically, this is a section about the safe use of pesticides that you have highlighted there.
At this time, Your Honors, does the defense also have permission to share a chart with this specific zoomed in subsection?
Of course.
Mr. Lewis, referring to this specific subsection of the building code with the heading pest control, how did you attempt to comply with this part of the building code?
Well, the code says that effective measures need to be taken to exclude pests from processing areas. We developed a bit of a pest issue a while back, and so we decided to perform several pesticide treatments in both our wine cave and bottling area to remove those pests.
So, Mr. Lewis, if I put treated insect-infested areas with pesticide, would that be right?
Yes, that's correct.
Now, moving on to that first subsection, how did you attempt to comply with that portion of the building code?
Well, this section says that use of pesticides is permitted only if precautions and restrictions are put in place to protect against contamination. Of course, I don't want anyone getting sick more than anyone else does, so we were very careful at Peonia Estates to always remove anything from a room that was going to be treated and cover up any equipment that couldn't be moved out of the room. We then left everything covered up and removed for at least 48 hours after pesticide treatment. I also took the liberty personally of every August when we did our harvest to rope off any grapes that I thought might have been exposed to excessive amounts of pesticide and just throw those right out.
So, Mr. Lewis, if I put removed equipment, covered remaining equipment in plastic, and kept all equipment out of treated area for 48 hours, would that be right?
Yes, that's correct.
Now, that final subsection, Mr. Lewis, how did you attempt to comply with that portion of the building code?
This section says that pesticide chemicals should be identified, held, and stored in a manner that protects against contamination. At Peonia Estates, as far as I can say, all of our pesticides are very clearly labeled. They're all held in a storage shed that's about 600 feet away from any food production areas. And our policy was always to only use pesticides in areas that had been properly prepared for a pesticide treatment using the procedure I just talked about.
So, Mr. Lewis, if I put labels on pesticides, pesticides never handled near food, and storage shed built approximately 600 feet from all food production areas, would that be right?
Yes, that's correct.
At this time, Your Honor, does the defense have permission to share Exhibit 4? This has already been pre-admitted and authenticated per stipulations 3 and 16. Mr. Lewis, what is this document?
This is a map of Peonia Estates.
Does it accurately reflect Peonia Estates as you know it?
Yes, it does.
Mr. Lewis, you mentioned that you built a storage shed. Where was that storage shed built?
The shed is right there where you can see between the Vineyard Views gazebo and the wine cave.
And when was that storage shed constructed?
It was built in July of 2018, and we started storing all our pesticides in that shed right after it was done being built.
Okay, I want to move on to about a month before the wedding. Do you know who Riley Atkins O'Keefe is?
Yes, Riley Atkins O'Keefe is a health inspector for the FDA. He did an inspection of Peonia Estates in May of 2019 and found some FDA code violations.
Mr. Lewis, to the best of your knowledge, what was the extent of the citations you received?
There were a couple issues that O'Keefe found, but the primary thing that he was concerned with was that there were pesticides that had been left in our bottling room before the area was properly prepared for a pesticide treatment. It was honestly really frustrating for me because I work very hard to consistently keep Peonia Estates at a high level of excellence. We weren't just against FDA code, but we were against my own personal standards, and it was very frustrating for me, honestly.
Mr. Lewis, were the pesticides being used at that point in time?
Oh, goodness, no. We had just really had a bit of a miscommunication between employees, and some canisters had been moved into the room before everything had been properly removed and covered up. It was just a momentary lapse in judgment, and the treatment process hadn't begun at all.
Mr. Lewis, were you storing the pesticides in the bottling room?
Again, no, it was just a momentary lapse. Like I said, our pesticides are normally stored in a separate shed far away from all the food production areas.
Lastly, Mr. Lewis, do you know what Cara wine is?
Yes, Cara is our 2019 wine.
And do you have any knowledge of a Cara wine bottle testing positive for pesticides?
Well, I know the police recovered a bottle from one of our dumpsters out behind Peony Estates, and that apparently tested positive for pesticides. I honestly have no idea how that could have happened. All I can say for sure is that the dumpster where they recovered the bottle is the same one where we throw our discarded cans of pesticide.
Thank you, Mr. Lewis. I have no further questions at this time.
Thank you, Mr. Finn. Ms. Klinkhammer, you're cross.
Yes, Your Honor. Good afternoon, Mr. Lewis. I just want to talk about your job at Peony Estates. So part of your job is to train employees to handle pesticides safely, right?
Yes, that's one of my many responsibilities.
These trainings are meant to keep people safe, true?
Of course.
If someone drank, part of keeping people safe is keeping pesticides from getting into the wine products, right?
Yes, of course. It's very important to everything we do to keep people safe.
Right. And Mr. Lewis, you know that if someone drank wine that had pesticides in it, they could die, true?
Yes, it can be very dangerous.
So you have to take precautions to keep pesticides and wine separate.
Yes, absolutely.
Some of these precautions include moving bottles out of the room before bringing in pesticides, right?
Yes, that's one of the things that I just talked about. That's part of our procedure.
In addition to plastic wrapping equipment before bringing in pesticides, true?
Yes, of course.
If you don't, excuse me, Mr. Lewis, but if you don't follow these precautions, there can be deadly consequences, right?
Yes, of course. There's a reason that we have those procedures in place.
Right. As an employee of Peony Estates, you would agree with me that it's important to follow these precautions to keep customers safe, true?
Yes, it's very important.
Well, I want to talk about that visit with the health inspector that you were just talking about with Mr. Finn. In May of 2019, Peony Estates developed a mite issue in the bottling area.
Yes.
And in order to deal with this, you had to spray chemical pesticides in that area.
Yes.
Now, you made the mistake of moving those pesticides into the building before you moved out the bottles, true?
Yes. Like I said, we just had a bit of a miscommunication, and our normal procedure was slightly mixed up. And so we had that brief period where we had pesticides in the bottling area before things had been properly prepared.
So that's a yes to my question, that you moved the pesticides into the building before you moved out the bottles, right?
Yes.
You also moved those pesticides into the building before you plastic wrapped any of the equipment, right?
Yes, like I said, we hadn't properly prepared the room yet for a treatment.
Now, having pesticides in an active production area is a health code violation, right?
It's an FDA violation, yes.
Right. And on May 8th, the health inspector from the FDA, Riley Adkins O'Keefe, he arrived.
Yes, he did. It was a surprise inspection.
And in this surprise inspection, he found that, in fact, Peony Estates was storing pesticides in an active production area, true?
Yes, that was his finding. Again, we had just kind of moved things in a little bit too early, and he happened to be there when that miscommunication took place.
Mr. Lewis, I'm not asking if he arrived there early or whatever. I'm asking you that he found you were storing these pesticides in an active production area.
Yes, that was his finding.
And because of this, Peony Estates received a health code violation from the health inspector.
Yes, it was an FDA citation.
For the improper usage of these pesticides, right?
Yes.
Now, after this May 8th visit, you told Harper Martini, the owner of Peony Estates, that Peony Estates needed to be more careful about pesticide use in the future.
Yes, it was part of our response to the inspection.
You told Harper Martini, the owner, that the employees needed to be completely retrained on popper storage and handling procedures.
Yes.
And Miss Martini shrugged you off, didn't she?
Well, yes. Things were very busy and hectic at the winery at the time, and unfortunately, we just didn't have the time to fully commit to a complete retraining of our employees at that time.
Miss Martini actually told you everything has pesticides on it nowadays, didn't she?
Yes, that was her remark.
Miss Martini told you a little bit of pesticides isn't a big deal. She said that.
That's what she said, yes.
After you received a health code citation for the improper storage of pesticides, Miss Martini forbade you from retraining employees on pesticides usage, right?
That's correct. Like I said, we just didn't have the time at that period in time to really go through that full retraining. I did try to put up some extra signage in our bottling area just to reinforce the training that the employees already had.
But to be clear, Mr. Lewis, Miss Martini forbade you from retraining your employees on pesticide usage, true?
Yes.
No further questions, Your Honor.
Thank you. Any redirect, Mr. Finn?
Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Lewis, when Inspector Atkins O'Keefe cited you for improper storage of pesticide, was that an FDA citation?
Yes, it was a violation of the FDA's 50-foot rule, as I understand it. That was within the FDA realm of what they would consider against code.
When Mr. Atkins O'Keefe cited you for improper training, was that an FDA citation?
Yes, again, that was against what the FDA defines as a violation.
Did Inspector Atkins O'Keefe give you any citations related to the Midlands Building Code?
No, he didn't refer to that code at all in the violations that he gave us.
Thank you, Mr. Lewis. I have no further questions at this time.
Are we through with this witness?
No recross, Your Honor.
All right. Then thank you, Mr. Lewis. And defense, you may call your next witness.
Yes, Your Honor. The defense calls Sam Arnold to the stand. May I proceed?
Yes.
Please state your name for the record.
My name is Sam Arnold.
What do you do for a living, Miss Arnold?
I work as a caterer here in Midlands. I run my own food service and I specialize in vegan and plant-based cuisine. I work with hosts and event planners to design the menu for all sorts of fun events, fundraisers, bat mitzvahs, weddings, you name it.
During your time as a caterer, have you ever worked with the Peony Estates Winery?
I have, yes. I actually used to jump at the chance to work with Peony Estates and their owner, Harper. Some of my clients, they tend to shy away from some of my vegan selections. They hear I use substitutes like aquafaba and tempeh, and they pretty much run out the door. But Harper lets me stock her kitchen with whatever ingredients I want. So I really enjoy working with her.
When did this professional relationship with Peony Estates begin?
2016. For a few years, Harper and I had a close business relationship. She even asked me to cater the wedding between her child, Casey, and Casey's fiance, Genesis. But then in 2019, Genesis passed away. Since then, I unfortunately haven't been able to do as much business with Peony Estates.
At this time, we'll have our trial technician share the Midlands Building Code. I want to talk a little bit about the law here in Midlands, Miss Arnold. Are you familiar with this document?
I am. This is the building code that instructs businesses here in Midlands about safety and health standards. Essentially, it keeps our workplaces, our clients, and our environment safe.
And zooming in on this specific section, Miss Arnold, what do you know about this section of this document?
Well, this is the section that talks about pesticide use. When you're like me and you're always chopping up fruits and veggies, touching dough, getting your hands in food and drink, you have to be careful about how you use pesticides. You have to follow this law here.
What, if anything, do you know about pesticides at Peony Estates?
I've seen pesticides there. I'm not big on pesticides myself, given the effect that misusing them can have on our environment. But the law does say that you have to keep pests away from food and drink somehow.
Keeping this specific code in mind, what did you see leading up to Miss Petrillo's wedding of the pesticide usage at Peony Estates?
Well, what I saw was pretty much what I would expect of all the businesses that I work with. Given my role, I keep an eye out for any sort of food safety hazards, and nothing I saw at Peony Estates regarding their use of pesticides ever stood out to me.
Now, when you did see pesticides at Peony Estates, were they identifiable?
Yes, they were labeled bug off pesticide.
So if we were to display on this screen, pesticides were identifiable, would that be accurate to your testimony?
Yes, that's accurate.
Ms. Arnold, did you ever see pesticides handled near food or food production areas at Peony Estates?
No, ma'am, I did not.
So if we displayed on the screen here, never saw pesticides handled near food or food production areas, would that be accurate to what you just told us?
That's right.
During your time working with Peony Estates leading up to the wedding, did you ever see pesticides stored near food or food production areas?
No, never anything like that.
So if we were to put never saw pesticides stored near food or food production areas on the screen, would that reflect what you've told us today?
Yes.
Your Honor, may this slide be preserved for the record and for use in closing arguments?
Yes.
So, Sam, would you have worked with Peony Estates if you were worried about their use of chemical pesticides?
Oh, of course not. Pesticides can be very dangerous for people, for animals, for our environment. So if I'd ever seen any pesticides at Peony Estates that looked weird or dangerous to me, I would have ended my business with them immediately.
Thank you, Ms. Arnold. I have no further questions at this time.
Thank you. Ms. Hale, you're cross.
Yes, Your Honor. Miss Arnold, you would agree with me that it's important to use pesticides safely.
Oh, of course. You don't want somebody eating or drinking something that's unsafe.
As a result, you personally are careful around pesticides.
Yes, I would never want one of my guests to end up sick or anything like that.
Right, Miss Arnold, and that's because you know that if you act carelessly with pesticides, there can be dangerous consequences.
I certainly would agree with that.
Now, Miss Arnold, you catered the wedding rehearsal on June 7th, 2019 for Casey Soto and Genesis Petrillo, isn't that true?
Yes. Unfortunately, the wedding did not end up happening. Genesis passed away, as I'm sure everyone here knows.
I want to talk about the wedding rehearsal on June 7th. You served the food that night?
I did. I prepared the food, me and my catering staff.
You and your catering staff prepared a buffet?
Yes.
This buffet was served to the entire wedding party that was there?
Yes, they especially enjoyed my salad that night. It was a success, I would say.
That's right. You also served champagne to the entire wedding party?
Yes.
Everyone at that wedding party ate your food and drank that champagne that you know of?
Oh, I'm not sure what all people ate. I do know that my salad was a great success, and I do know that I served champagne.
You know that no one besides Genesis Petrillo became ill on June 7th or 8th?
That's true.
You know that no one besides Genesis Petrillo, who was at that wedding rehearsal, died.
Oh, no.
Now, you talked with Miss Paxson about some things that you didn't see at Peony Estates, and I want to go into more detail on that. You remember being at Peony Estates in November of 2018 for an event?
Yes.
Now, during this time that you were at Peony Estates, you saw Harper Martini, the owner of Peony Estates, with a canister of pesticide.
I believe I saw her with one of those sprayer things, the thing that you put on your back kind of and spray. I wouldn't know how to describe it, but yeah.
That's right, you saw her with a pesticide sprayer.
Yes.
She walked into the kitchen with this pesticide sprayer.
Yes.
Now, when you said that pesticide didn't belong in a kitchen, she left with that pesticide, didn't she?
Yes, she immediately went and took it somewhere else.
Let's talk about where she took that pesticide. You remember her walking with that pesticide toward an employees only door?
Yes, I think it looked like she did that.
Now you know what's behind that employee's door, don't you?
I'm not an employee at Peony Estates.
Miss Arnold, you are aware that the bottling room is behind that door, though, aren't you?
Well, there's a lot of areas kind of in the employees only section, but I do think the bottling area maybe is one of those, yes.
All right, I want to talk about that wedding rehearsal that you attended. You remember bottles of wine being served at this event on June 7th?
Yes, gifts for the wedding party.
Most of the wedding party received 2017 Horizon bottles, didn't they?
Yes.
But you gave Genesis Petrillo a bottle of Cara 2019 wine, didn't you?
Yes.
Now, Miss Martini told you that bottle was for Genesis and only Genesis.
Yes.
I want to talk about why you're testifying here today. Now, you have a relationship with Peony Estates.
Yes, I've worked with them many times in the past.
Peony Estates makes up a significant portion of your business's income.
They do. However, like I stated earlier, I don't do as much business with them as I used to, so that income has gone down.
Miss Arnold, they still make up a significant portion of your income.
Yes, they do.
And you owe a lot of your success to Harper Martini and Peony Estates.
Oh, for sure.
And you're testifying voluntarily today for Harper Martini and Peony Estates.
Oh, well, yes, I am.
Thank you, Miss Arnold. No further questions.
Thank you. Any redirect, Ms. Paxson?
Yes, Your Honor. Ms. Arnold, on your cross-examination, counsel asked you about some pesticides that you saw during a November of 2018 visit to Peony Estates. When you saw these pesticides, were these specific pesticides identifiable?
Yes, they were. It was clearly pesticides. It was one of those backpack things, and there was bug off on it.
Now, did you ever see Miss Martini utilize these pesticides within that food production area?
And no, I did not.
And did Miss Martini store these identified pesticides within the kitchen at that time?
No, she took them out immediately.
Thank you. I have no further questions.
Thank you. May this witness be excused.
Yes, Your Honor, I have no recross.
All right. Thank you. And anything further for the defense?
No, Your Honor. With that, the defense rests our case in chief. With time permitting, we do request a brief 5-minute recess prior to closing arguments.
And who is the timekeeper? Do we have any concerns about time? When is the all loss time?
I believe all loss is at 2:41.
2:41. What time zone?
That would be I'm not sure. Eastern time is the 1:41.
I was going to say, because it's only 11 o'clock in the morning here in California. I know
it
these
would be
files
11:41.
don't go that long. Why don't we go ahead and take a 5-minute recess then? And to my scoring judges, this is an excellent time during the break to designate witnesses for awards. So we'll see everybody in 5 minutes. Thank you. All right, I know we have Ms. Hunsinger and Mr. Finn back, and you're going to be presenting the closing arguments. Are the 3 scoring judges back?
Yes, Your Honor.
That's 1.
Sorry,
Your
I was muted. Yes, I'm back.
And Ms. Zelensky, you're back?
Yes, I am.
Excellent. All right. Then Ms. Hunsinger, if you would please present plaintiff's opening closing argument.
Your Honor, Mr. Finn, members of the jury, may it please the court. The defendant, Peony Estates, is a winery here in Midlands. They produce and sell their own wine, and unfortunately, they've also suffered from a major pest problem. In order to combat this problem, the defendant has used chemical pesticides. While it's legal to use pesticides, there are also rules and regulations in place to ensure that those pesticides are used safely. Here at Midlands, businesses have to follow the Midlands Building Code, which outlines what businesses can and cannot do with their pesticides. Members of the jury, the defendant carelessly violated the Midlands Building Code by improperly storing their pesticides, which led to the contamination of the defendant's wine, which they then carelessly gave to a woman named Genesis Petrillo. Carelessness has consequences, and because of the carelessness of the defendant, well, Genesis Petrillo suffered the ultimate consequence. Genesis Petrillo, a young woman, a woman on the eve of her wedding, a member of our community, an unfortunate customer of Peony Estates, has died. It's because of this, we, as a plaintiff representing the estate of Genesis Petrillo, have brought forth the claim of negligence per se. In order to prevail on our claim, we just have to prove to you a couple of things. First, that the defendant, Peony Estates, violated a law, specifically the improper storage of their pesticides. And second, that Peony Estates' act of violating that law caused harm. It caused the death of Genesis Petrillo. We had to prove these to you by a preponderance of the evidence. Mr. Finn might come up here and tell you that that means we have to complete some perfect puzzle, but that's just not true. What this means is that we have to prove that it's more likely than not that Peony Estates violated a law and that violation caused the death of Genesis Petrillo. We have met our burden by proving to you 2 careless acts of the defendant that led to the consequence. Now, that first careless act was for Peony Estates to improperly store their pesticides. The second careless act was for Peony Estates to then serve that contaminated wine to Genesis Petrillo. And those 2 careless acts, they added up. They added up to the deadly consequence of Genesis Petrillo's death. So I want to walk through those one by one, starting with the improper storage of pesticides. Now here, the defense, they spent their time talking about, well, putting labels on canisters of pesticide or throwing out sections of grapes, but none of that matters. What matters is the improper storage of pesticides. For this, the defense wants you to believe, well, we build a storage shed. That also doesn't matter unless they actually used it. What you heard today is that Peony Estates did not. In fact, you heard from Inspector Riley Atkins O'Keefe, an FDA agent who told you what Peony Estates should have been doing with their pesticides. According to the Midlands Building Code, businesses, well, they've got to keep their pesticides far away from any of their products. The defense made a big deal about this FDA 50-foot rule versus the Midlands Building Code, but we know that what Peony Estates was doing by improperly storing their pesticides in an active production area, well, that would violate both. What you heard from Mr. O'Keefe is that Peony Estates, well, they kept their pesticides in the bottling room. And we may be wondering, why is that so important? Well, it's important because that's the one area of production that wine is exposed to the open air, where it's exposed to the contaminants in the air, where it would be exposed to the pesticides. The defendant's head winemaker wants you to believe this was just some sort of lapse in judgment. Members of the jury, this is how and when that wine got contaminated. We know for sure that one bottle in particular was contaminated because it was unsealed. You heard Mr. O'Keefe testify to seeing a bottle of Cara on a shelf, completely uncorked, unsealed, and open. That's important because it leads us to that second careless act that served contaminated wine to Genesis Petroleum. Well, we know that Mr. O'Keefe told Peony Estates to throw out that bottle, and they didn't. We know this by the testimony of Mix Casey Soto, Genesis Petroleum's fiance. What they told you is that they saw that open bottle of Cara being served to Genesis Petroleum the night of the wedding rehearsal. We also heard this from Sam Arnold. Members of the jury, Genesis Petroleum is the only person to have received that bottle of wine. She's the only person to have drank from it. She's the only one to have died. It's important because it leads us to that deadly consequence of Genesis Petroleum's death. Here you heard from two doctors, Dr. Quan, the treating physician, and the defense's own expert, who agree the most likely cause of Genesis Petroleum's death was pesticide poisoning. Dr. Cannon, the defense's own expert, agreed that there's compelling evidence that Cara bottle of wine had pesticides in it. That's because Genesis Petroleum, she had pesticides in her system. What else she had in her system? That was wine. No coincidence that that wine that she drank, the Cara wine, the only wine that we know she for sure drank that night was the Cara, made by the defendant. Carelessness has consequences. Because of the carelessness of the defendant, Genesis Petroleum is no longer with us today. You must hold the defendant accountable and find them liable. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Hetzinger. Mr. Finn, your closing.
Yes, Your Honor. May it please the court, counsel, members of the jury, you can't finish a puzzle if you don't have all the pieces. Now, what does that mean exactly? Well, in order for the plaintiff to prove a case of negligence per se, there are several elements or pieces that have to be put in place by a preponderance of the evidence. And while Midland's case law states that there are 4 elements to negligence per se, we're really only here to talk about 2. Did Peony Estates violate the safety statute? And did that violation cause the harm that the statute was intended to protect against? Now, at this point, you're all no doubt aware of Midland's Building Code, Section 12-100, since, well, frankly, we've been talking about it all morning. And we'll get into the weeds of it a little bit more as we go. But at this point, all I really need you to know is that it's the specific language of the Midland's Building Code that the plaintiff is burdened to prove. Not an FDA guideline, not some sort of auxiliary safety health code. It's the Midland's Building Code. And until they can prove that an actual violation of that code was committed by Peony Estates, then no harm, or that an actual violation was committed by Peony Estates, then they have not met their. So how do we know that a violation wasn't committed? Well, I think the best place for us to start is with the caterer at the wedding, Sam Arnold. As a third party who's actually familiar with the building code in question, Ms. Arnold could only testify to a handful of times she actually saw pesticides at the winery. The most pertinent of which was when she saw a canister of pesticide in the kitchen. But should Ms. Arnold have been concerned about this canister of pesticide? No, because again, she's familiar with the building code. Midland's Building Code, subsection 2-1-I, states that only the following toxic materials may be used or stored in a facility where food is exposed or processed. A, those required to maintain clean and sanitary conditions. And I'd imagine that none of you would think your kitchen was very clean if you found cockroaches in your sink. Now, you might be questioning the weight of this witness's test. She works at the estate a lot, but you can't testify to the winery's habitual safety practices. Well, that's why the defense called Austin Lewis the stand. As the head winemaker, Austin told us that because the winery was close to a nearby swamp, pesticides had to be used in order to ensure that their customers were receiving a safe product. And this is explicitly what the building code tells Peony Estates to do. As subsection 2-2 states that no pests shall be allowed in any area of a food facility, and effective measures are required to ensure that no pests are in any production areas. But obviously, these pesticides have to be used in a manner that is safe. And as the building code states, pesticides can only be used if restrictions and precautions are put in place. So what restrictions and precautions were in place at Peony Estates? Well, the head winemaker told you that when they had to perform pesticide treatments, all equipment that could be moved was moved, and what was too large to move was subsequently wrapped in plastic. This procedure would last 48 hours before all equipment could be moved back to its proper location. The head winemaker also told you about the canisters themselves and the employee training. He told you that, to the best of his knowledge, all of the canisters of pesticide had labels on them. And he told you that, to the best of his knowledge, he has no experience of pesticides being used or handled near open wine. He also told you about Peony Estates' project to build a new storage facility approximately 600 feet from all food production areas. Members of the jury, these are not particularly fun procedures to do. They are both timely and costly, but they exist not only to ensure the safety of their customers, but because, again, it's what the building code tells them to do. Meaning that in regards to the plaintiff's claim that Peony Estates violated the Midlands Building Code, they have not met them. Now, maybe you disagree. Maybe you say, Mr. Finn, I don't know. It still feels like Peony Estates violated that building code. Even if you think that's true, the plaintiff does not win by showing that a violation was committed. They have to show direct cause and effect, that but for Peony Estates' violation of that code, no harm would have come to the plaintiff. They can tell you that pesticides were found in Genesis Petrillo's system when she was reported to the hospital, so it must have been from the wine she drank. Except the expert we called today told you that because it was found in her stomach contents, we don't know how it got there. They can tell you that a bottle of 2019 Coral was found in a dumpster and it had pesticide residue on it, so it must have been the cause of the harm. Except the head winemaker we called today told you that that same bottle of wine was found in a dumpster where they throw away all their pesticides. Members of the jury, they have shown no evidence to display that that bottle of 2019 Coral was contaminated prior to it being found in the dumpster. And unless they can prove that pesticide is radioactive or some force of God was at play in the bottling room, they have not proven causation and they have not met them. Members of the jury, I wish I could tell you what happened on June 7th and June 8th of 2019, but that is not my job today. That is the plaintiff's, and they have failed to do so. They have failed to do so because the puzzle that they have constructed before you in the last 2.5 hours is frankly just missing too many pieces. Find Peony Estates not liable. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Finn. And Ms. Hunsinger, do you have any time left, and do you desire to make a rebuttal statement?
Yes, Your Honor.
You may do so.
Mr. Finn just came before you and he told you that the plaintiff's case is missing pieces, but what the defense is missing is a reasonable explanation. You see, the story that they told you, they tried to tell you that to Genesis Petrillo, well, she must have ate or drank something else other than the Cara that was laced with pesticides. Despite the evidence that no other food served the night of the wedding rehearsal contained pesticides. Despite the evidence that no other alcoholic drink or other drinks at that wedding rehearsal contained pesticides as well. Members of the jury, this is not a reasonable explanation. We're asking you to take for coincidence that Ms. Petrillo had pesticides in her system and that Cara bottle of wine had the exact same pesticides. That is no coincidence. That is the carelessness of the defendant. So when you consider what is more likely to have happened, you'll find that our story isn't missing any pieces. You'll find that this is truly a story of the carelessness of the defendant. And carelessness has consequences. For that reason, we ask that you hold the defendant accountable, find them liable. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Hunsinger. All right, judges, you should complete and submit your ballots at this time. All competitors, please turn on